This is from Puentedura. I'd like to turn now to storytelling in games. There are three reasons for this. First, there are some rather unique characteristics of storytelling in games that need to be looked at if one is to use these games to their full advantage in the classroom. Second, some people might want to use games as a way of getting at storytelling in other media. As I've mentioned before, you can, for instance, use games to get at storytelling in theater. That's great, but again, you need to understand in greater detail then how storytelling works within games to make the best use of them in this regard. And the third reason is that some of you might be thinking at this point, well, it's nice that I can do these things with commercial games in the classroom, but perhaps, maybe, just maybe, I might be able to write my own game. And if you're thinking along these lines, well, by the end of the series of podcasts, we'll have looked at some ways you might actually think about writing games. And certainly in this scenario, you also want to understand fully how storytelling works in games so you can write the best games possible. Okay. So the first thing to realize is that game stories have certain very definite characteristics that have to do with multiple aspects. The first aspect is where games storytelling approaches derive their ancestry from, and this is based on research by Nick Mumford. And you have to look at the overall profile of the sources ranging from riddles, puzzles, literary machines. These are experiments that have been carried out over the years in terms of what can be done with quasi-mechanical approaches to the production of texts. So, for instance, the group known as Oulipo did a lot of work in this regard. Also, text games such as Dungeons and Dragons are an important ancestor of modern-day games. Artificial intelligence machines such as Eliza, Doctor, that simulated certain types of therapists in conversation with you are also important ancestors of interactive fiction. And finally, early computer games, which tended to center on mazes and hunting different types of creatures around the maze. These are all important ancestors of interactive fiction in particular, but by extension of all modern-day video games that have strong narrative components in general. So when you look at storytelling in games, the line that they derive their storytelling practices from are not traditional novels or short stories, but rather these storytelling components or these storytelling ancestors. You also have to realize that when you have a game, because of the combination of the fact that you're playing a game, but the machine is also giving you feedback about what is going on in the game, you have certain components that are not present in traditional narrative. So you have components that relate directly to the storytelling process, to the story itself, so diegetic or hypodiegetic components, and also components that relate to elements that tell you, well, what's going on in the program. So for instance, if you look at a game like Zelda, the movement of your hero Link within the program corresponds to the diegetic components of the program, the storytelling elements of the program, but you also have extra diegetic elements such as the score that keeps track of, for instance, how many coins Link has retrieved. And these can take the form of either inputs, in other words, the commands you give the program can operate on either of these levels. They can also take the form of outputs. In other words, the program is giving you feedback either within the context of telling the story or within the context of giving you this feedback about what's happening with the machine. And also, in addition to what's happening in terms of direct inputs and outputs, there are other characters that inhabit the game world. So you have yourself as the player. You also have other players which are non-player characters. These are characters that are controlled by the computer but not by the player. And finally, there are other beings, other persons that inhabit the game world that will typically provide, if you will, a landscape for your story. So once again, this is a little bit different from traditional storytelling, because in traditional storytelling, while there are extradiegetic elements such as, for instance, the page number on each page of the book, they typically don't form a key component of the storytelling experience, unlike what happens in games. Henry Jenkins has also looked at the spaces that games create and found that they operate in at least 4 different ways to provide an architecture for telling stories within games. First, they operate as evocative spaces. If you step into a dark cave full of jewels in a game, it will evoke other stories, such as, for instance, the ones found in the 1001 Nights. So you will already have that space evoking narratives by virtue of its existence. They also act as spaces within which stories are enacted, in other words, stages within which the drama played out within the game takes place. And you have both broad stories as well as tiny local events being told within these spaces. A third way in which they act to provide a narrative architecture is to have an embedded narrative. So there's a narrative of what can and cannot be done by the player in a space. Again, think of Link figuring out which boxes are fixed, which boxes are movable, which guards are friendly, which guards are aggressive. Well, these are embedded narratives within the game, and this is an information space for which the narrative rules, the narrative story is discovered by the player. And finally, you have emergent narratives, which are narratives constructed by the player on top of this world. And a particularly beautiful example of this can be found in games such as World of Warcraft, where the player assumes the role of a hero, but also will tell stories to other players in the game about their doings. In other words, they will be constructing other narratives on top of what is going on within the game world. Finally, Gonzalo Frasca has looked at narrative levels in terms of what can happen at different levels of a game. Let me make this a little bit clearer. At the first level, you have a narrative that has to do with what happens in the game. So if we're talking about the Zelda games, here is where is Link going, who is Link talking to, what is Link chopping down with his sword. At the second level, we have what the player can do. In other words, this is a narrative level that's occupied not just by the sequence of events in the game, what we talked about at level 1, what happens. It covers the entire scope of, at any given point in time, what a player could do in that space. So what can happen here is that there are certain events that can happen within level 2 in terms of what the player can do that do not necessarily advance narrative in level 1. At level 3, we have now the goals of the game. The goal rules also have a narrative level here, and this is what the player must do to win. So we have the level where things are happening, the level of what the player can do, and now we have the level of what the player must do by the winning or losing conditions imposed by the game. And finally, very interestingly, we have level 4, which is the meta rule system, which is what can the player do to modify what's going on in the other 3 levels. Now this can range from finding glitches in the game. So there are games, for instance, Asteroids was an early example, where the player could have certain things not happen. In the case of Asteroids, not be shot out of the sky by the saucer or hit by an asteroid by hiding in a little corner of the game, and that was a glitch. In other cases, you might have a player modifying the game by virtue of actually finding a way to cheat in the game. And these types of game cheats are generally shared and publicized among players, and they're viewed as also something that can be viewed as part of, well, what's going on in the game, of the story of the game. And finally, some games allow for players to modify them. And most recently, a very successful game in this regard is a game that has been released called Little Big Planet, where the whole purpose of the game, beyond the introduction, is for players to create, modify their own levels within the overall game. Okay, now that we've seen the aspects that are unique and characteristic of game storytelling, Let's take a look then at how stories overall are constructed. Not just in games, but as we're going to see, we're going to be using some models that have been developed for looking at how stories are constructed in general. In looking at the structure of stories, a very popular model is Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. And Joseph Campbell posits the idea of what he calls the monomyth, in other words, this sort of universal myth structure in which we have our central character, the hero, and the hero goes through a process he calls the hero's journey, and the hero's journey has three major components. In the first component, the departure, the hero is called to adventure, so the hero goes out to help someone who is in need of help. In the second portion, the initiation, the hero goes through a process of change so that they can reach a point where they are able to deliver the aid that is requested. And in the third part of the journey, the hero completes their task, gives the aid that is required, and returns and receives some reward after that return. So this is the overall outline of the hero's journey. And it is possible to look at games and say, for a game like Zelda, well, can it be analyzed in terms of the hero's journey? And in fact, it can. But this is a very general framework. It's actually a bit more useful if we go to the more detailed version of the hero's journey. Now, I'm not going to go through each and every of these subcomponents of the hero's journey, because quite frankly it would take very long, and in the references at the end of this podcast I've included a link to both Campbell's book as well as to an excellent page on Wikipedia that details what each of these subcomponents looks like, what it corresponds to in traditional stories. What I will point out though is that each of these components can be made to correspond to an element in a game. So if we look, for instance, under initiation, the road of trials, each of those trials that Campbell describes as the trials that the hero must go through can be made to correspond to a task to be completed by a player in a game. So this is a good way both of analyzing how the different tasks that, say, Link must complete in Zelda correspond to the overall narrative development of Zelda as a game. And it's also a good way to think about, well, if I were writing a game, how would I make sure that the tasks I put before the player flow naturally as part of the game's storytelling and not feel like they've been, well, bolted on in a more or less irrelevant and indiscriminate way onto the central narrative. Now, this is as far as Campbell goes. You can actually break each of these subcomponents down a little bit further, but to be perfectly honest, there are other frameworks that work even better than Campbell when you need finer-grained analysis of a game structure or finer-grained development of a game structure. And one of the frameworks that I found works best is the one that was developed by Vladimir Propp. Now, Vladimir Propp looked at Russian folktales. He looked at a large number of Russian folktales and said, let's boil this down to the key formal components of each of these folktales. So Propp was not looking so much at the meaning of these folktales as he was saying, look, what appears in each folktale as a character? What types of characters are there? Can we look at this as a minimum set of characters that appear in all folktales? And in fact, he found that you could reduce the set of characters to 7 primary or main characters and then a few supporting characters in all folktales. So the main characters he found are the protagonist, the hero, the antagonist, the villain, the dispatcher who sends the hero on their journey, the donor who will provide the hero with a magical item that will help them on their quest, the helper who will do what their name indicates for the hero, the person sought for, who is typically either the princess or the king of the kingdom, who will be the person saying to the hero, you must, for instance, slay so many of these dragons before you can marry the princess, etc. In other words, they're the person sought for, they're the person that is setting these tasks overall before the hero. And finally, you also have a false protagonist or false hero who will at some point attempt to impersonate the real hero. So these are the 7 main characters, and as supporting characters you'll have family members for the hero as well as connectors that again do exactly what their name imply between different other characters or different portions of the story. The very interesting thing that happens next is what happens when you have these characters then on the stage of these tales. What type of functions, what type of roles do they assume, and how do these roles, functions, etc. move the tale, the story forward? And Prop found that there were 31 primary character functions, and in case you're wondering, no, this is not an eyesight test. I certainly don't expect you to read through each and every one of these right now. You have access to a PDF with a printout of these that you can read easily at your leisure. But what I want to point out is that each of these functions corresponds to a module that can be made in turn to correspond either analytically or creatively to what is happening in a game. So for instance, if we go to character function number 12, number 13, and number 14, these relate to the donor who has this magic agent that the hero needs, testing the donor by virtue of a set of tasks. So these components give you very fine-grained structure where you might say, okay, how does everything that happens in the game correspond to one of these? So 12 might be the donor presenting you with the task, almost like a mini tutorial, like the ones we saw in Mario. 13, the hero's reaction, might be some type of a task where the hero is beginning to develop a skill that they will need to acquire the agent. And 14, the receipt of agent, would be what happens once the hero has developed the skills necessary in the game to acquire that agent. So not only do we get the type of plot advancement analysis that we have from Campbell, we also get very fine-grained structure that we can put to good use in terms of how we're thinking about storytelling in the game. Again, as was the case for Campbell, you have a link to Prop's original book, as well as to an excellent website which has much more detail on how each of these character functions works, which character functions are coupled to each other, and how you can have multiple shorter or fragmentary tales, what Prop called moves, within the scope of an overall bigger narrative. So far, so good. But neither Campbell nor Prop tell us something that's quite important to us, which is, well, how long should each section of the story run for? So we're going to turn to a suggestion to get us started along this path from Sid Field. And Sid Field says, well, if you're looking at a movie, the basic screenplay should be divided roughly like this in terms of time. You have Act 1, which takes the first 25% or so of the movie. Then you have Act 2, which takes the bulk, in other words, the next 50% of the movie, and it's divided into a first half and a second half. And you have the third act, which takes the last 25% of the movie. And then you have 2 key plot points that drive the plot along, one that starts approximately somewhere between 17 and 25% of the movie, the other one which starts somewhere between 67 and 75% of the movie, and then you have the midpoint of the movie as another key point, and you have Act 1 is the setup, Act 2 is the confrontation, and Act 3 is the resolution of the conflict. And you can see that you could rather easily map this in turn onto structures such as those proposed by Campbell and Prop. Fine. There's only one problem. Games are not movies. So if you're looking to say, well, what percentage of the tasks proposed by the game should be in each part, you can certainly use it that way, but you can't quite use it as simply as you could if you were writing a movie screenplay. In particular, Lee Sheldon has studied the different possibilities that are opened up by the fact that, unlike movies, games don't have to follow a single path. They can branch out, and this of course will have consequences in terms of how you distribute different puzzles, different game events within the overall story. So he identifies 5 major modes: linear branching, control branching, web, modular, and we're going to look at examples of each of these. Before we do that, though, I should mention that no game follows a single mode strictly. All games have to some degree aspects of different modes, but some games, the ones I'm going to be using as exemplars, tend to follow one mode primarily. So the first mode is linear storytelling, and in this mode game events follow one right after the other. This is the mode that's closest to movies, so in this type of scenario you can certainly use Sid Field for more than just a rough guide to tell you how you should distribute game events. And the example we're going to be looking at is Portal. In Portal, you're progressing through a 3D puzzle game, and as you complete each stage of the puzzle, by, in this case, for instance, taking a cube to a given location to open up a gate, you are herded through these elevator doors and you go to the next stage of the game linearly. In other words, no access to other levels, other tasks other than the next one that's been determined for you. The next structure is branching stories. And here, instead of having a single linear path, at any given point in the story, you can branch out or branch back towards one of the other storylines. So you can see that you have choices that lead you in different directions, in fact may lead you to different endings in the game. Clearly here Sid Field is no longer that useful as a guide, other than to say, well, within each major branch, here's roughly how you might want to distribute the different proportions of events, but it would be at best a very rough guide. So for this type of scenario, the example I've chosen here is La Pucelle Tactics. This game is a simple RPG tactics game, and in this game, according to how you choose to tackle different battles with what characters in what order, you have different branches available to you, and indeed different results in terms of what happens to your characters in the game. Third type is controlled branching. If you have uncontrolled branching, one of the problems you have is it can get very, very, very quickly hard to manage. So you have to start thinking, well, I have 10 different endings. Now I have to think about 10 different paths for different endings. It's getting harder and harder to figure out how to distribute events so that the game doesn't feel like it's too bulky at points, too light at others. Control branching says, look, you still have one major plot line like you did in the simple linear example, but you do allow for some branching out at different points. And this branching is always brought back to the main tree. So here you see that from step A you can go to steps B1, B2, or B3. But no matter how you complete one of these, in other words, which one you choose, you wind up at step C as the next story step. In other words, you have a linear story, but with some branching to keep you from having that feeling that you're being driven along on rails. And the example I've chosen here is Grim Fandango. Grim Fandango is an action-adventure which poses different puzzles for you. The overall storyline progresses linearly, but how you solve puzzles at each point and in what order allows for some controlled branching. So it's an excellent example of this type of approach to story development in games. Yet another possibility are what are called web stories. Now, in web stories, not only do you branch out going forward, but you also allow all possibilities. In other words, you can go backwards, you can retrace to a previous step. So web stories are in some ways the most flexible ones in terms of how branching is allowed, but they're also some of the most difficult ones to control. And while many games have small subsections of the game that are constructed as webs, very, very few games indeed are constructed completely as webs because of this difficulty. And the example I've chosen here is Jak and Daxter, the Precursor Legacy, which is a platformer that has modules that you can complete to gain certain elements that you'll need for other tasks, and within subsections of the game, the structure is indeed very web-like. The final structure I want to look at is one that's been pioneered by Sheldon, and it's what he calls modular storytelling. In modular storytelling, Instead of thinking right off the bat about the paths you're going to take through your story and how they're connected, whether linearly or with controlled branching or what have you, you instead think of the modules that make up your story. And now, once again, go back to prop and think about how each of those propian components could be viewed as the basis for one of these modules. For instance, think of the different tasks the donor might set out for the hero and have each of those tasks correspond to one of these boxes. So what happens next is that instead of saying, well, you go from task A to either task A or task B or task C. If you go to task B, then you'll go to task D, etc., in the way that we saw before with any of the branching forms. Here you say you can access the tasks in lots of different orders, but what happens is that the import of what each task means narratively changes according to the order in which you tackle the tasks. So again, to think of the donor example, assume that one of the tasks involves, in say a platformer game, swimming through a space, and another one involves climbing another space. Well, if you go to the swimming task first, then the climbing task might be the culminating task for the donor activity. In other words, that's the really tough task that you have to overcome before you get the magic item. Or if you found them in the reverse order, if you went to the climbing task first, then the swimming task would be the culminating task. So you see that what's available to you here is a form of narrative branching that goes beyond the other types of structures we've looked at, that allows you to play with the idea of different modules having different stories implicit in how you traverse them without prescribing a definite branching from the outset. An example of a game that has this type of approach built into some portions of it is Far Cry 2. And in this case, you play the role of a mercenary, and according to how you tackle different tasks, which tasks you choose at which point in time, the overall narrative will indeed evolve in a fashion similar to what we've seen here for the modular setup. We've covered a lot of ground in this podcast, and I would suggest making what we've discussed a bit more tangible and concrete through the following exercise. Pick one of the games, either from this podcast or one of the previous podcasts, that has a strong narrative component. I don't recommend picking Tetris, for instance. And then apply to that game all the topics that we've discussed today. First, look for the intrinsic game approaches to storytelling that we discussed in the first part of the podcast. And then, by looking at the YouTube playthroughs of the game, try to see if you can discern some of the elements that Campbell and Prop talk about within the overall game narrative. The last component, which would be Sheldon's approach to the structure of games, is unfortunately a little bit harder to make out from the screencasts, because the screencasts only take one path through the game, and to understand how the branching works, you really have to play the game and try out the multiple paths yourself. As always, here are the resources used throughout this podcast. Here are the books and websites for both Campbell and Prop, should you wish to explore both authors and their thinking in greater detail. And finally, here are the game videos used as examples in this podcast. In the next podcast, we'll be looking in greater detail at what motivates game players. Until then, enjoy the tales told by games. Have fun.